Teacher Workshop. We've got a couple of Sundays left in this quarter before we jump on into the next one. And so this week, we are focusing on, yet again, another familiar story to many of us coming directly from the 11th chapter of John's Gospel. So as we have been in Luke, Matthew for a couple of weeks, bouncing back over to John. If you're vaguely familiar with the outline of the Gospel of John, and this might be one of your more favorite stories from the Gospel of John, you might already have an understanding of what this entire chapter entails. But talking loosely about the resurrection story for Israel in the story of Lazarus as a loose title for this lesson. So first green box, upper left-hand corner, we need to understand as I try to work with you through this. This is a principle that's important for us no matter where we are in Scripture. We don't always have to dedicate time to this sort of thing whenever we're teaching our students, but especially when it comes to the gospel stories and any particular attention that is brought by the author to the detail of where they're at, what's going on. And so John makes us keenly aware that Passover is getting ready to come up. Now, one way that we might be used to reading the Gospel of John, as we've done that multiple times over the course of our lives probably, is by the time we get to this particular point, we know that it's signaling, or we think that it's there to signal us that this is about to become Jesus' Passover or Passion tied in to the Passover celebration. And that's true to an extent, but really that's not so much the reason why John is telling us this here at this portion of the gospel. And the other gospel writers have already made us aware of the fact that Jesus' passion happens at the same time Passover is being celebrated. So John wants to bring this up perhaps for a different reason, again, because Jesus isn't going to be crucified until around John 18 on through 19, and so we're several chapters removed from that. Having said that, understanding what Passover is, which would take us to this first blue block, as I've said many times over, but just in case there's anybody out there who perhaps hasn't heard it or maybe hasn't heard it in a while, the Passover always marks the end of exile and the beginning of Exodus. Now, I say that while obviously it's clear with respect to the original story of the Exodus contained in the book of Exodus. We're talking about every time we see Passover being mentioned or celebrated, I really would like to draw special attention and focus to the second time Passover is celebrated at the beginning of the second year when Israel is about to leave Sinai. And then we mark that with respect to the repeated pattern over and again when Passover is celebrated, namely in the time after Solomon builds the temple in the lives of Hezekiah, Josiah, when they renew the temple. And then with that, the very first celebration that marks the time when the temple renewal has come to its completion and the people are allowed to come and begin to worship again, and sacrifices recommence outside of just the daily burnt offering that's given in the morning and the evening, happens to be at the time of Passover. And if you remember the stories around the time of Hezekiah, who comes on after his father Ahaz, one of Israel or Judah's worst kings, who had shut up the temple for a period of years and wouldn't allow proper sacrifice to actually transpire. Or even worse than that, Josiah, who comes after his father Manasseh, who had reigned for over 50 years in Judah and had done some of the most grotesque and spiritually adulterous things that any king who followed in the line of David had ever done. And so with that, we understand these were spiritually dark periods, and the exile of the people of Judah and all the people of Israel, for that matter, was locked up in what was going on at the headship of these kings, that when God brings a new king onto the scene, an exodus of sorts, even though they never go out of the land or come back into the land, transpires, a spiritual exodus, which seemingly after the original Passover in Egypt, which is the only Passover outside of the one celebrated in Zerubbabel's day, that is actually connected with some sort of migration from one portion of land to another portion of land. All the rest of these Passover patterns, both Old and New Testament, all happen with people still being stationary where they are, and more or less what we're seeing is a spiritual overlay, a spiritual significance being brought to what's really happening in the story. So all that to say, as John is bringing this up, what we're seeing here is that he's hoping that we'll pick up on the breadcrumb trail and recognize that there's something very significant attached to the Passover that's about to happen. He's signaling to us that as Israel has a dark history, as a rebellious nation, constantly being called back into covenant faithfulness through these repeated patterns of exile followed by exodus and coinciding with a actual literal celebrated Passover moment, that we're seeing now the fruition of this theology that's been in play now for nearly 5 centuries. Second blue block. The last exile was that of Babylon. Again, this was a literal exile where the people were expelled out of the land, unlike the previous periods of exile, like during the epoch of the Judges, when they're all located in the land, but of course they have committed spiritual adultery against God. God allows marauders, bandits, even nations to come and oppress them, whether it's temporarily, it's always temporarily, I suppose, but whether short stints of period or even long periods of time that last for decades. Eventually God brings that to an end with a new Moses-like deliverer who trounces those enemies, drives them out of the land, unifies the people, and then they have a period of restoration, both physically or materially and spiritually. The last actual exile, though, of Babylon was them leaving. Finally, the curses of the covenant being enacted, they are pushed out of the land, vomited out, if you use the words of Moses. And Ezekiel and other prophets predicted that there would be a new Exodus movement, but Ezekiel perhaps gives one of the most prolific pictures. Isaiah talks about it being a march back into a new Eden, and God is going to be reviving the landscape behind them as if He is making deserts turn into gardens, literally a new Eden space for Israel to go into, and it's going to completely transmogrify creation. Now, Ezekiel, on the other hand, gives a more prolific picture of there being mountains of just dead bones all over the place. Ezekiel 37, we are told the prophet was ordered by the Lord to speak to these bones, and he says, I will cause breath to enter to you, and you will live. I'll put tendons on you, make flesh grow on you, cover you with skin. I'll put breath in you so that you will come to life, and you will know I am the Lord. So this new Exodus movement is going to be nothing short of a resurrection from the dead. This is the first point, probably the main point of connection I would want to bring to bear with respect to what's going on here in John 11, captured in the actual resurrection movement of Lazarus that we need to point back to as goes the Old Testament significance of this event. Because the resurrection in Ezekiel comes through the words of the, quote, Son of Man, end quote. That is the title that God continues to use over and again for Ezekiel, which of course, for many of us, I would imagine has probably perplexed us. Why of all the prophets is Ezekiel the only one who continuously is called Son of Man, or better yet, Son of Adam, over and over throughout the scroll? And we don't have the time now to really lay all that out, but it draws a huge measure of significance when in Ezekiel 37, we have the Son of Man who is being told to speak to the Ruach of God. That is always to be understood as God's Spirit, God's breath, God's wind that He sends. And of course, in the earliest stories of Scripture, the operation of, or activity of the Ruach of God is bringing order to the chaos that was before creation began. And then the next thing we see is that God commands that breath to enter into the man He carved out of the clay, and that man became a living soul. Now God is allowing, by the agency of an actual son of Adam, to speak to this wind, this spirit, this breath, to enter into lifeless, inanimate bodies that were just a few seconds ago piles of bones, now covered with soft tissue inside and out, but standing there completely lifeless. But once the breath enters them, we have a whole army of people revived, enlivened, resurrected from the dead. And this is a vision that Ezekiel sees. It's not literally happening, but what it is symbolically referencing is the idea that Israel's restoration after this Babylonian exile comes to its end is going to fruesce and crescendo in a full-on resurrection from the dead. That is just ever so slightly winked at when Cyrus the Persian gives the command for these people to leave their homes that they've settled in Babylon or wherever else. If they want to return to Jerusalem, they have his blessing. They actually have his purse strings for all that they will need, but that only begins the journey. It hasn't even come to completion yet by the day of Jesus, 5 centuries later. He is actually the servant of Isaiah 43, Isaiah 42, who was talked about here as being the one who is going to bring about this final Exodus. So, first orange block in the middle of the screen, We have this passage given here from John 11 where Jesus is saying to Martha, the first sister who is speaking to Jesus about the fact if he had been there, their brother would not have died. True statement. Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me, even if he dies, he will live. So everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she said. I believe you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who comes into the world. Now this is supposed to be connected to what John says at the very end of his gospel. When he gives us his thesis statement, basically, rather instead of at the beginning, toward the end of it all, when he tells us the reason he chose to put these things down on parchment was so that in reading and believing and connecting these signs, we would understand that Jesus is the Son of God, and by virtue of believing that, we would have life. This stands out as the epicenter of all the signs that Jesus had begun, the first of those being turning water into wine, and we followed the breadcrumb trail until now we get to what some scholars would say is number 7 of all those signs, because John stops numbering after number 2. Now, with this, I think one thing that we often as Bible readers kind of lose is the shock value that comes from Jesus raising people back to life. The one thing that sets Lazarus apart from anybody else is the fact he's been dead for 4 days. Jesus has not done that with anyone yet. Everybody that we see Jesus raising from the dead are people who had literally just died. One question of that could perhaps be the widow's son, the widow of Nain in Luke's gospel, because at this point the funeral procession is actually underway. So who knows how long that guy had been dead, but presumably no more than 24 hours. Again, Lazarus, his body buried, probably not anointed properly with spices and perfumed oils and whatnot so that it would not smell so rancid after 4 days, was not anointed in this manner. And we can kind of guess that clue from the way that the sister Mary comes and used those funerary spices to anoint Jesus' feet after he has raised Lazarus from the dead. I digress. Point being is that we've already seen Jesus raise many people from the dead already. And this in and of itself is not that revolutionary considering that prophets in the Old Testament, both Elijah and Elisha, have done the same thing. In fact, what's very impressive about what Elisha does is not only raise 2 men, but the second guy is a man who was raised to life after just falling through a hole and landed on Elisha's dead bones. And yet God reanimated this man and brought him back to life. Very impressive, one might add. That being said, what is so impressive about Jesus raising Lazarus, aside from the fact it's 4 days after the fact? It's where it fits in the story and what's going on here and what this ultimately is meant to represent. And what I mean by that is we consider Lazarus to be a picture of Israel. Not because Lazarus is a rebellious person, not because Lazarus is someone who with his mouth has honored God, but yet his heart is far from the Lord. Lazarus, for all intent and purpose, as far as we can tell, is not only dearly loved by Jesus from the message that's sent to him, but probably was a sincere and devout Jew who clearly gave himself over to practicing righteousness as best as anyone possibly could at this given time. Hence the reason why Jesus found himself to be such great friends with him, one could imagine or assume. So aside from that, Lazarus is a picture of Israel because Lazarus is an Israelite. It doesn't have anything to do with whether or not a person's a devout Jew or they are a spiritual adulterer, an idol worshiper. It's the fact that Jesus has come to open the door for all. But first, the house of Israel has to be addressed and ministered to. And the story of Lazarus connects intimately with the story of Israel per the Ezekiel scroll and what he intended to do once the exodus that Messiah is going to bring comes to pass. What we need to connect is not the idea that the exodus begins and ends with the relinquishing of the captives that are in Babylon and throughout the Persian Empire that come back in the days of Zerubbabel. That is a physical exodus. The spiritual exodus of Israel never commences. In fact, we see, if anything, a sputtering and a stammering of that effort when we look at the books of Ezra, moving on into Nehemiah, especially in the days of Malachi, more than a century after those people have been in the land, presumably, and they are starting to trend backwards and adopt some of the practices that their forebears did prior to the exile, hence the reason the prophet is lambasting them and why God is deciding to be silent and not send a prophet for nearly 400 years until John the Baptist arises. So first blue box now, underneath these 2 boxes on the top of the screen, Jesus offers a very Elijah-like prayer that in like fashion is meant to affect the same outcome. a return to the Father. So if you're not following me yet and you're not really convinced that perhaps this is connecting those stories, then notice the similarities between how Jesus formulates this prayer, the only prayer of its kind in all four Gospels, and that of Elijah when he's on Mount Carmel after the prophets have spent all day in their shenaniganry trying to get Baal to respond with fire from heaven. It's not because Jesus is so much in the presence of rebels, although there is quite a crowd who is gathered to see because they were part of the mourners surrounding the house in Bethany that's now followed Jesus and the sisters out to the side of the tomb to see what's going to happen. And there are many who are going to respond in faith, and there are going to be many who, despite what they see, are going to be even hardened more so in their hearts. Jesus says in John 11, Then Jesus raised his eyes to the Father, and he said, Father, I thank you that you hear me. I know that you always hear me, but because of the crowd standing here, I said this, so that they may believe that you have sent me. Not saying there's ever been a needless prayer that Jesus has ever said, but these words almost border that in the sense of Jesus is openly saying, I know I do not need to pray to you, Father. He has received the power to raise the dead to life. He has done so at a distance from people who were near the brink of death or were already dead. That being said, Jesus does not have to raise his hand to the Father every time he is going to raise someone back to life again. He purposefully prays this for what the last half of the last sentence says, so that these people would know without equivocation Jesus was sent by the Father as his servant. Go to the words of 1 King 18. So Elijah approaches the altar. He says, Look, or Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known that you are God in Israel, and I am your servant. In other words, you can almost hear the words of Jesus here, that you sent me, and that at your word I have done all of these things. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so that these people will know that you, the Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. So, in the moment of Elijah on Carmel, this is another moment of spiritual exile ending in an exodus. Now, it's a little glorious for a moment on the summit of Mount Carmel when they're actually delving destruction to the prophets of Baal. But by the time they get down into the city of Samaria, it seems like all that's kind of fizzled out, and the reaction that Elijah wanted with the destruction of Baal's temples and shrines all over the land doesn't materialize. And of course, he is put on the run with Jezebel measing out her threatenings against him. That being said, that doesn't happen with Jesus, of course, but the idea is if we can connect the story and the synopsis of what's happening from the transition of the Old to the New Testament, and we recognize that Jesus is the end of their spiritual exile that's been going on now for nearly 5 centuries since their expulsion from the land, that he is the one bringing about their spiritual exodus. I reference you to Luke 16 when Jesus is on the mountain being transfigured. I believe it's Luke 16. It's either Luke 11 or Luke 16. For some reason, my brain is misfiring on that. But either way, Luke's account of the transfiguration before Moses and Elijah. In the Greek rendition of that, we hear that these men are speaking with Jesus about his pending exodus that's coming up when he goes to Jerusalem. So those two spell it out for us in no uncertain terms, that what's about to transpire when Jesus goes to Jerusalem and faces down the Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians, is eventually turned over to Pilate, tried after his accusations by the kangaroo court in front of Caiaphas, then crucified to then be resurrected. All of this is a Passover that is ending an exile and beginning an exodus per the original picture of Exodus 12 through 13. And so with that, what we have captured in the story of Lazarus here is that Jesus is raising Lazarus as the 7th and final sign in this gospel. Or maybe it's the 6th sign if his resurrection itself is the 7th sign. Either way, those two events are intimately paired up to show that now is the time that Ezekiel was speaking about, when dead bones will live again, be covered in flesh, filled with the animating, life-giving breath of God breathed into them. They have now become a new army that is ready to not only go back and occupy the land, but per the instructions of Jesus in Matthew 28 and Acts chapter 1, they are starting in Jerusalem and they are going to blanket the world with the gospel of the kingdom, and that Jesus is cosmically ruling at the right hand of the Father, so that, because all authority is given to him, his subjects have all authority on earth to go and spread this message without having to be beholden to anyone else telling them they can or can't. Last blue box for us. So the resurrection of Israel, as typified through the raising of a dear loved one. Notice that. It's Lazarus. Jesus has allowed Lazarus to die so that, as was the case with the blind man of John 9, the glory of God could be made manifest. It could have been anybody that was nameless and unfamiliar to Jesus, but it would not have quite had the same amount of impact that Lazarus' raising does, not only because of the emotional value of it to Jesus, but what it means for the grander story of Israel in this gospel, because John is the only one who includes it. Raising a loved one, Lazarus, and it will come at the expense of the Son of Man, who must be offered for the nation in true Passover style. Again, in John 11, he tells us the Passover was near. Many went up to Jerusalem from the country to purify themselves before the Passover. And they're all looking for Jesus and asking one another as they stand in the temple, what do you think? Surely he's not going to come to the festival, will he? Because now the heat has been really dialed up against Jesus. In fact, at the beginning of Lazarus' death story in John 11, we understand the disciples are a little apprehensive when Jesus gets this message from the one sent by the sisters to say, please come quickly, the one you love is sick. And Jesus tells them, we have to go back to Judea. And they are the ones that raise the objection. Lord, you know when we were there last, they tried very hard to kill you. And certainly if you go back, you're just putting yourselves right on into their hands. The target's going to be squarely on you, and they probably are going to be successful, right? That's their concern, their fear. All that being said, the people, of course, think the same. With all the scrutiny levied against Jesus and with the actions that are being taken by the high ruling council of the great Sanhedrin and the authority that they are wielding against people, trying to use fear tactics to keep them from entertaining the idea that Jesus is Messiah, saying if anyone is even caught speaking these words on their lips, they will be expelled from their local synagogue. And again, the Sanhedrin is kind of like their Supreme Court. There are local Sanhedrins at any given town and village, but the great Sanhedrin that convenes in Jerusalem is the final say in all these matters, and every Sanhedrin is going to have to fall in line with those edicts. No one would let them in any synagogue throughout the land of Israel or Galilee, for that matter. I should say Judea or Galilee. That being said, we go on to the end of John 11, whereas John brings this tiny account to an end after these people have asked this question to say, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all. And again, these are those who are standing in his presence and are concerned that Jesus is wielding this power, not just the supernatural aspect of it all, but the influence amongst the people with all them following Jesus. He says, you know nothing at all. You're not considering that it's to your advantage that one man should die for the people rather than the whole nation should perish. John tells us that Caiaphas did not say this on his own. He had nefarious reasons for saying it. He was saying it because he, of course, wanted to deliver Jesus up as a political prisoner to Rome and have them do the dirty work since they were not allowed to any longer. And by putting this man to death, even though it might make him a martyr, hopefully if they could instill enough fear in those who were following Jesus, as had been the case for many other Messiah figures that had come before Jesus, their movements fizzled out very quickly. We have a testimony to that very thing by Gamaliel in the book of Acts, who tells the Sanhedrin, if you press on these men and you try to extinguish their efforts, if it's not of God, it will fizzle out. However, if it is of God, there's nothing you can do to stop that. That being said, that's what their intent is. But he's actually being charismatically moved by the Holy Spirit to utter these words because, as John is telling the readers, he's prophesying that Jesus was going to die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to unite the scattered children of God. So John is telling us that Jesus is going to be delivered up as a Passover sacrifice before we even get to this final Passover. To say that Jesus would die means Jesus is going to be substituted. Granted, the first picture of substitution we might have in Scripture as far as sacrifice goes in the story of Cain and Abel. Gotcha. Or perhaps maybe in the burnt offerings that are given by Noah after he disembarks the ark. But that story really comes front and center when we look at the story of Abraham and his offering of Isaac as a burnt offering. Not so much for the atonement of sin per se, different discussion for a different time. But that becomes the backdrop for what the Passover is really going to signify. Because every house is underneath the jeopardy of the wrath of God falling that night. but every house is given over, or I should say, given up in exchange for the firstborn of every family. And the firstborn of Israel are substituted out, of course, for either the lamb or goat put in their place. That becomes the essence of sacrifice, or the atoning nature of Passover. And of course, Jesus dying on Passover weekend, what we're seeing here is that Exodus is intimately tied into the concept of one having to be substituted out for another. So, Lazarus is delivered. He, typifying Israel, is going to live as Israel is going to live through the one who has to be sacrificed in their place. We can clearly see by John and what he says after the incident of Lazarus being raised from the grave. Instead of it dialing back the scrutiny and the persecution against Jesus, it raises it even more. Now it's literally at the point of fever pitch. The pot, or I should say the kettle, is whistling at this moment. And instead of people being scared at the idea that Jesus can raise men from the dead who've been that dead for 4 days and their bodies are horribly decomposed, bloated, almost to the point where it's not even recognizable anymore, that they could kill all of Jesus' armies he might raise behind him, and he could instantly raise them from the dead. There's truly nothing they can do to stop this man, and yet they have the gall, the hubris, to think that they could put this man to death. And so they quickly began to enact their plans as far as trying to figure out a way to get close enough to him to snatch him up and then kill him before he or his disciples can do anything about it. So Israel being raised truly does come at the expense of the Son of Man. For Israel to live again in this Ezekiel 37 way is going to require sacrifice. Even though in Ezekiel's scroll, in chapter 37, nothing is said about anybody having to die so that this army could be raised from the dead. But what we do see is in its connection into the New Testament stories, as we're walking from the Old into the New, this gets tied into the concept that exile ends with Exodus, but only in the vein of Passover. And that Passover is going to require the sacrifice of none other than God incarnated in human flesh. So, I hope this has been helpful with respect to seeing this. It's not that you have to really go into this level of detail as a teacher, but I'll say this. No matter at what age you might be teaching, as goes the demographics of those represented in your class, trying to begin to sow the seeds of this to help our students understand how both testaments of the Scriptures are connected together at multiple points, and trying to get our students to begin to understand that John is riffing off Ezekiel in so many ways, especially when it comes to new temple, eschatological temple theology. This is just one more place in which he sees inspiration being found in Ezekiel to bring that over into a story that he's isolating away from any of the other material the other gospel writers have used for the sake of trying to get his readers to understand something new and different about Jesus that the other Gospels are also talking about, but just in a different way and using a different angle. So I think it's helpful even if you can just spoon feed a little bit of that in there rather than just simply talking about the story of Lazarus being raised from the grave and the fact that this is yet another encounter of Jesus raising someone from the dead. I think if we continue to do that, especially for adult students who have been immersed in the Scriptures for a long time, it might be one of those moments where they find themselves just a little bit unchallenged and by virtue of that bored, but I could be wrong. So, any questions? Well, if not, as always,